Hello everyone, I am Brinda Sapra, a student of Shivaji College, pursuing BA Honours Economics, currently in my first year. So today in this video, we are going to cover the topic of how changes in price affect the consumer's choices. So what do we mean by this question? We mean that when the price of a commodity changes, whether it increases or decreases, it tends the consumer to changes its consumption levels. So whether the consumer will respond by increasing the consumption or decreasing their consumption, we are going to study that. Since we are studying from a consumer's point of view, so we must know about the three concepts. Number one, budget line. Number two, consumer's optimum. And number three, the price effect. Budget line is nothing but it's just the consumption bundles that a consumer can afford. And consumer's optimum is the point where the indifference curve of a consumer is tangent to the budget line of the consumer. And price effect, what is it and what are its different types, that we are going to study in detail in the video ahead. Now, we are going to discuss in detail about the price effect. Well, price effect is of two types. Number one, income effect, and number two, substitution effect. What does income effect state and what does substitution effect, that we are going to cover now. Beginning with the income effect. It is the effect on quantity demanded when real income of the buyer has changed, owing to change in the price of a commodity. Well, here we notice a key term which is real income of the buyer. Well, real income of the buyer is nothing but the purchasing power of the consumer. So basically, by income effect, we means when the price of a commodity changes, it changes the real income of the buyer. That is, the purchasing power of the buyer has been changed now. So the effect it will have on the quantity demanded, that is known as the income effect. Let us understand it in a more better way with the help of an example. For example, using 10 rupees, I can buy 10 cups of tea. But now the price of tea has fallen from rupees 10 to rupees 5. My income remains constant. But because the price has fallen from rupees 10 to rupees 5, the purchasing power has been increased. My real income is increased. And now, with the same income and the decreased price, I can consume 15 cups of tea instead of 10 cups of tea. So, the effect, that is the increase in quantity demand by 5 cups, is the income effect. Okay, I hope it is clear to you. Now we are going to discuss about the substitution effect. The substitution effect states it is the substitution of one commodity for the other commodity when it becomes relatively cheaper. It basically means when the price of one commodity changes, it either becomes relatively cheaper than the other commodity or it becomes relatively expensive. So the shift or the substitution of the other commodity for a commodity, that effect is known as the substitution effect. Now let us understand substitution effect as well by a help of an example. For example, there are two commodities, let's say tea and coffee. Suppose the price of tea has fallen. Now, as the price of tea has fallen, so as a consumer, for me, tea has become relatively cheaper than the coffee. So, I would wish to spend more on tea rather than coffee. So, that substitution of tea in place of coffee, that effect is known as substitution effect. The coffee has not become expensive in terms of price. It's just that it is relatively expensive in terms of tea because the price of tea has fallen. So I would like to buy more of tea and substitute tea in place of coffee. So this is what substitution effect states. I hope both substitution effect and income effect are clear to you. Now let us take a look of how consumer choices changes when when there is a change in price level. For that, let us take an example where we have two goods, say good X and good Y, and both of them are normal goods. We have made this assumption that both the good X and good Y are normal goods. Now let the price of good Y be rupees 20. Let this be the initial price. Now let us assume that the price of good Y, let us assume that the price of good Y was initially rupees 20, but now the price of good Y has fallen to rupees 10. That is, there is an decrease in the price level of good Y, which is a normal good. So now, what will happen when the price of good Y will fall? As a consumer, we will notice that the budget line will rotate. It will rotate, it will have an outward rotation because the price has fallen and the consumer is now able to afford more of good buy at the same level of income. So we will notice that there will be an outward rotation in the budget line. So this is how gonna our initial budget constraint look like and the new budget constraint would look like. Now let us take a look what the price effect will state. So we know that there are two types of effects in price effect, in the income effect and substitution effect. As the price of good Y has fallen, which we have seen above, that the price of good Y has fallen. So now the purchasing part, the real income of the consumer has increased because the price of the good has been decreased. So the consumer would like to buy more of both the goods. So he would wish to increase his consumption of good eggs, and at the same time, he would even like to increase the consumption of good wine. So we will notice that he would like to increase the consumption of both good eggs and wine as his real income has increased. His purchasing power is increased. But what does the substitution effect states at this point? The substitution effect will state that as the price of good Y has fallen, so it has become relatively cheaper in comparison to good X. Since it has become relatively cheaper, so the consumer would wish to increase, yeah, as we have seen that the good Y has become relatively cheaper. So the consumer will increase the consumption of good Y. At the same time, the good X is now relatively expensive than the good Y. So he would like to decrease the consumption of good X and substitute good Y in place of good X. I hope it is clear till now. So moving ahead, so we noticed that when the price of good Y has fallen, the income effect convinced the consumer to increase the consumption for both the goods, good X and good Y. But the substitution effect stated that since good Y has become relatively cheaper, so we must substitute it in place of good X, which has now become relatively expensive. So when we look at the total effect, in case of good Y, both income effect and substitution effect states that the consumer must increase its consumption. So we will notice that the total effect will be a positive one. The consumer will increase the production consumption of good Y. But in case of good X, the income effect states that the consumer must increase its consumption, but the substitution effect states that the consumer must decrease its consumption. So the total effect can be either increasing or it can be either decreasing. So it will depend whether the income effect is more dominant or the substitution effect is more dominant. When the income effect will be dominant, the consumer will increase the consumption. However, when the substitution effect will be dominant, the consumer will decrease the consumption of goods. So here we notice that whichever the effect is dominant, the consumer will act accordingly. I hope it is clear. Now, let us plot the situations graphically and see how the graphs turn out to be. So taking the example, when the substitution effect is greater than the income effect. So this is how gonna, so let this be our initial indifference curve at the initial budget constraint, and let this be a new indifference curve on the new budget constraint. So this will be our initial optimum, and this will be our new optimum. So here we have seen that the consumption of good Y has been increased, but the consumption of good X has been decreased. This is the same thing which we discussed above. Here, when the substitution effect was more dominant, it stated that the good consumption of good Y must increase, but the consumption of good X should fall. And this is what we have plotted here, that the consumption of good Y has increased, but the consumption of good X has fallen. Now, let us understand a similar diagram when the income effect is more dominant than the substitution effect. So let this be our IC curve 1 on our initial budget line, and let this be the indifference curve 2 on the new budget line. So this will be our initial optimum, and this is going to be a new optimum. So again, here we see that the consumption of good Y has increased, and now this time the consumption of good X has also increased when the income effect was greater than the substitution effect. And this was the similar thing which we discussed above over here, that when the income effect is greater, the consumer would like to increase the consumption of both the goods. So it is clear now from the diagrams and with the help of this schedule that whether the consumer will increase or decrease his or her consumption, it depends on whichever effect is more dominant, whether the income effect is more dominant or whether the substitution effect is more dominant. We can use the application of income effect and substitution effect on studying various other examples as well, where for example in this case we have taken that the price of good Y has fallen. We can take another example as well where the price of good Y has increased, or where instead of change in price of good Y there is a change in price of good X. Or maybe when instead of both the goods being a normal good, one of them is inferior or the other is normal good. So we can apply the application of income effect and substitution effect on various other examples as well. But basically the income and substitution effect stated what they tends to tell. This is what we have discussed in this video. I hope how changes in price affect the consumer's choices is clear to you. Thank you.